This is Dr. Bradley Wolfe, and I'm going over Chapter 3 in the Public Speaking Project textbook on ethics in public speaking. So there's a lot of ethical considerations for you to take into account when you're creating a speech, both in the creation process of the delivery, but also as a listener. So as you're listening and critiquing speeches, there's appropriate ethics that we should follow. So this example, starting from the beginning, is a student who's giving a speech, and they decide they're going to give a speech on selecting a florist for a wedding. And it's an informative speech, like how to do this. So it talks about during the speech, she's kind of running out of time. So she skips past a couple of the verbal citations, some of the sources, but she still provides information. So she thinks Maggie here thinks overall she did a good job of picking this topic, selecting a florist that she thought would work well for the other females in her class. So when preparing for the speech, there are a couple things that Maggie could have done better. First of all, the audience analysis. You didn't think about all the audience members involved. She was focused on a traditionally female topic and tailoring the language to the females in the class. And the second issue there was omitting the sources, right? You don't want to omit verbal citations. Verbal citations are very important. They help boost your credibility. Say, hey, I did my research. So say, hey, I did my research with credible sources. This is why these sources are credible. But also just for the matter of giving credit where credit is due, giving credit to those sources you used is part of the ethics that we look at in public speaking. So this is about just having integrity with your speech. This chapter talks a lot about how integrity throughout the presentation. So again, you can read through that. It gives a couple more examples about Bill Clinton and the whole Monica Lewinsky scandal, and also about the National Communication Association, talking about the principles of ethical communication. I'll read through this quote. The NCA, National Communication Association credo of ethical communication, claims that ethical communication is fundamental to the responsible thinking, decision-making, and development of relationships and communities within and across contexts, cultures, channels, and media. So again, it's very important from many perspectives to be ethical, and hopefully you already have a good appreciation for morals and ethics coming into this class. So we're just building on what you already know and building on what you already understand. So here, there's a P missing here that bothers me, a little typo, but philosophy. So we look back again, Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato. That's a lot of public speaking goes back to that ancient Greece from very much a Western perspective. In the United States, we use that Western perspective in public speaking. But again, there are certainly other perspectives regarding ethics and ethical standards that we should take into account as well. But he talks about ethics and ethos, specifically credibility. We have ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is credibility. Pathos or pathos, some people pronounce it both ways, is emotional appeal, and logos is logical. So with your speech, it should have you should be a credible speaker. You should use a bit of an emotional appeal to connect to the audience, and you should use logically constructed arguments and reasoning throughout your speech. So it's really a matter. Talks about ethics as a matter of virtue and being ethical with it. So that's how they define ethics in the public speaking realm. So ethics and ethical standards, there's a variety of standards that can be used. So again, who is your audience? What is the place you're speaking? In some places, ethics are going to be differently. Your ethics when you're giving a speech to your family or friends, you may not need to do, academic verbal citations with specific details about where you find the sources. But if they ask you for the sources, you should be able to present that to them, right? You should be able to show them where you came up with it. Came up with that information. That's part of ethics. Same if you're having a debate with somebody else and they're unable to say their sources, you may be questioning their ethics or integrity with that information, and not just there, but the person who created that information, the source they got it from, right? A lot of people are just finding the information they find online, social media, TikTok, some news networks that are providing not the greatest information. So if you're citing them as your source, it also can make you look like less an ethical speaker as well by not using the most ethical sources. So really it's throughout the preparation and delivery of the speech where it's important to be ethical and follow moral principles that work for you. So again, you can read through this more. This section here talks a little bit about more from a Buddhist perspective and the Dalai Lama about how good communication should exhibit restraint, responsibility, and kindness. So it's really about compassion. So it talks here about having compassion is more essential than truth. So they're saying from this perspective, from kind of this Buddhist perspective, it may be justifiable to be untruthful in a situation when deception is a part of the process of caring for another. So it's really about what is your belief system that informs what you view as your ethical standards and what you believe is appropriate. Again, in your interpersonal relationships, you may give a white lie to your significant other so they don't get hurt in that situation. So there again, what ethical principle do I, value kindness, or do I value honesty more as an ethical principle? So some of this ethics is just understanding your own ethical standards. There's not a right or wrong answer in a lot of these situations. Now, with public speaking, when we're grading you in front of an instructor, you're going to want to cite your sources because that is part of being ethical in the speech. But there's other things where there's some flexibility, some different perspective and values that can be, the values can be valued to different degrees by different people. So that could be part of your speech as well. When you're giving a speech to an audience, you may analyze the audience saying, hey, what values does this audience care about? In the United States, we talk a lot about freedom, democracy, liberty. And so those are common values across the United States. But does everyone hold them in the same way? In chapter 1, it talks about vague language, and some language was more concrete, some language is more abstract. So that abstract language, how the same words mean different things to different people. So that may be part of ethics as well, just defining what you mean by these different terms and not just trying to say something because it can have a broad appeal. If we look at politicians, sometimes we critique politicians and say they're very good talkers, but they don't really say anything, right? They're just saying general, generic values that a lot of people hold, and that each person interprets them differently. So everyone agrees with them, even though people don't all have the same opinion, just because of how broad of an abstract of language they're using. So again, is that ethical? Is it ethical just to say things because you think people are going to agree with them and without even taking stances? So we want to make sure, what sort of stances do we each have and how we're going to stand behind them with our speeches. So we can go back down here to section 3.3 on ethical speaking. It talks here an example from Australia. In which some of the speech that was given by this politician mirrored a section from a movie, the movie The American President. So they seem to mirror the dialogues with only some names changed, and some people say it's plagiarism, right? So we see sometimes if you're taking something from another source or another speech without quoting it directly, we look at that as plagiarism, and it's broadly seen as unethical. There have been cases where students have maybe had an internship, or one case where a student had an internship at it was some journalism internship with a newspaper or online media source where they plagiarized a portion of their text and they got fired, right? That is very unethical as a reporter in order to take things from another source without quoting it directly, without attributing it to that source. So when you're giving a speech, you're going to want to be very specific about when you are doing a direct quote. If you are using direct quotes, you want to be explicit about it. In your outlines as well, you want to be explicit using quotation marks and appropriately citing the information. So your audience knows that this isn't my ideas, these are my words, but I'm quoting this other source. Now, quoting other sources can boost your credibility. Using direct quotes can be very valuable, but you'll want to be careful not to do it too much because it should be your own speech. And so it talks here about being honest and avoiding plagiarism. So they have this little cartoon here. Copying without permission is stealing, and copying without permission is stealing, thief, right? So they quoted themselves. They just quoted the other person, and then they said it was a thief, just repeating it back to them. So kind of a little funny cartoon. But again, you're going to want to make sure to cite your sources and to appropriately let your audience know what information you use to do the research. Even if you're not doing a direct quote, even if you're doing indirect quote or just sharing information, you should let them know, hey, this isn't my information, right? This is research that I did. It helps boost your credibility as well. So it's not just about being ethical, but it's about boosting your credibility as a speaker. Hey, I researched all these other sources. They're credible sources. This is why they're credible. This is the information I found from them. That can be very helpful in making a quality speech. So it talks here about identifying sources. So again, if you don't identify sources that you use, it's plagiarism. If you're trying to take from someone else's outline or someone else's paper, even if you're giving the speech yourself, even if the outline has plagiarism in it, that could be significant issue in terms of ethics. So it talks about different types of plagiarism. There's global plagiarism, patchwork, and incremental plagiarism. So global plagiarism is very obvious. You're taking a speech that's not your own work. So you can take that, you may be taking someone else's outline and submitting it as an assignment. I've had students do this. I've caught them. That's not their own work. Certainly we have plagiarism checkers at school. So in the submission folder, it goes through a plagiarism checker, but also there are things that I can just see on there that tipped me off that this was plagiarized, that the student did not do it. In this case, the student had information in the speech outline that I didn't cover on how to make a speech outline, which I recognize as, we weren't that advanced yet in the course. And I'm like, why are they including all this other information here? That seems weird. And then I was able to do a little bit of digging and found out the original author of it. So certainly there are ways that I can go through and instructors can go through to figure out if you're plagiarizing. But global plagiarism is taking someone else's speech and saying it's your own. So even if you're the one delivering the speech, if you didn't create the speech, if you didn't create the outline, that's still plagiarism. But there are less obvious types of plagiarism as well. So patchwork plagiarism, which I've seen a number of times, is when people are taking bits and pieces from one or more sources and represents the end result as their own. So again, it's taking little pieces here. So again, if you're using direct quotes, that's fine. You can direct quote things. But I've received assignments where the plagiarism checker says, oh, this paragraph's from this source, this paragraph is from this source, this paragraph's from this source. So again, they're doing a good job of doing research. This is where I get a little frustrated because it's like, okay, the student's doing some of the right things. They're doing research. They're getting to know the information. I'm like, okay, this is great, but you need to do that extra step and make it into your own, right? You can't just regurgitate research that you found and just drop it in there, right? Again, make it your own. Make it your own work, your own information. So patchwork plagiarism is, again, you're using multiple sources without citing them, without doing the direct quotes. You're just trying to take information in there and making it your own. So even if it's just part of the outline, even if you do it in one section, that can still be considered plagiarism, even if it's not the entire work and you were just using it for one section. Again, you want to cite it appropriately. And it gives some real life example here if you'd like to read through, how someone in a workplace was talking with their coworkers about a new idea. The two of the coworkers gave some feedback, and then the third person, Carly, in this case, she pitched the idea, the collective idea that they did without crediting the other people. So in a workplace, if you're, there's always these examples of really bad bosses who steal ideas from their workers, and that's really frustrating, right? People do not like when you take their work without crediting them. So it's very important here, especially in the United States, where we're the most individualistic culture in the world. We like people citing sources. It's very important value in the United States to cite sources and to provide that information. Now, in more collectivistic cultures, they may be more okay working as a team, but then they'll present it as a team's idea, right? They're not going to say, oh, I did this as my idea. They're going to say, this was the idea of our team. So even in a more collectivistic culture where we may not want to call out individual people, you'll still cite those sources and allow people to know, hey, this is where the research came from, that this is, part of our collective good. The third type of plagiarism, again, don't do any of these plagiarisms, please. Not in my class, not in another class. The third type of plagiarism is incremental plagiarism, when most of the speech is the speaker's original work, but the quotes or other information have been used without being cited. Incremental plagiarism can occur if you're like providing a statistic or some quote, but you're not providing the source. So it's clear you're making a quote. It's clear you're using outside information, but where did you do the research? I've had this where students have an outline, but they're not doing those in-text citations, the verbal citations to show which source is used where. And then they'll have a reference list. And I'm like, okay, great, you have this reference list, but where did you find each of these facts? Which fact goes with which source? So you want to make sure you have those in-text citations. Certainly, I recommend going to Purdue OWL, O-W-L, Purdue OWL. And they have both how to do APA, MLA, and different citation formats for in-text citations. But you're going to want to make sure, this is from Purdue OWL as well for citing sources. You're going to want to make sure you're citing sources. If you're doing the research, you're doing the work, you should get credit for it. So just make sure you're citing everything appropriately. So it gives a column of when to cite or when don't cite. So if you're doing your own lived experiences, your own observations or insights, your own thoughts, your own conclusions about a subject, you don't need to cite that. That's your information, right? It's your ideas. That's fine. When you're writing up your own results obtained through lab or field experiment, that's your own. If you're using your own artwork, your own photographs, your own video or audio, that is your own. When you're using common knowledge, right? If it's things that most people know, or most people in your audience are going to know, you don't need to cite a source. That George Washington was the first president of the United States. Most of your audience in the United States is going to know that information. And then when you're using generally accepted facts as well, you don't necessarily need to cite it, but I would recommend using sources whenever you can, because it helps boost your credibility. So it's not just you saying this, but there's a source involved. When you do need to cite, I went a little backwards here, right? When you do need to cite, if you're using words or ideas, it could be a direct quote, it could be a paraphrased information, but you should be citing that information that you got from outside sources. If you interviewed someone or had a conversation with someone, that couldn't be a source, right? You can say, hey, I interviewed my grandma for this information, and this is what she provided me. And here's why she's an expert. Here's why she's credible to speak on the topic, right? You're going to want to boost her credibility or boost the credibility of whatever sources you have when citing information. If you're copying the exact words or unique phrase, you're going to want to cite that as a direct quote. If you're reprinting a diagram, chart, pictures, or other visual materials, where did you find those pictures, right? If you have a visual aid, where did you find each of these sources? Or what sources did you use to find those pictures? Just giving them credit, right? Your photographers, artists like getting credit for their work. And when you reuse or repost any electronically available media, including, again, videos, audio, other messages, other media, it's good to have sources there to verbally cite it. Sometimes when I give a presentation, I verbally cite it and I have it listed on the PowerPoint. I actually have it listed on each slide. If you have an image, you can have a little box at the bottom to say where that image is from. Or some people have a reference list at the end of their slides as well, to go along with the verbal citations. So we went through deciding when to cite. I went through that chart here, which is a very good chart to keep in mind. You could always go back to that if you need to look at it again through the textbook chapter. But it's also right making sure you're citing the sources properly. So paraphrasing and direct quotes, I talked about this a little bit already. Paraphrasing means a sentence or a string of sentences that shares learned information in your own words. So if you're just, hey, I learned from this source, here's my summary, right? Here's the ideas that I gleaned from it. A direct quote is when you're using the author's ideas word for word, or you may replace one word in it and it can still be a direct quote. There's different ways to do it, but you want to make sure you're using quotation marks. And if it's a direct quote with keywords or phrases, you should have it both quoted in the speech outline. And when you're presenting the speech, if you're going to read that quote, you should be making clear that it is a direct quote from a source. You can use phrases such as begin quote, end quote to tell your audience what part of your speech is a quote and what part of the speech is your own. So developing accurate citations. I always recommend my students use the tutors on campus in order to help with these citations, especially if you're not as familiar with it. I've needed to do this a lot when I was in college, and quite frankly, I didn't use the tutors until grad school. And I'm like, oh wow, why haven't I been using you all along? Right? Why haven't I been getting these help and using this resource the entire time? So I know when I went to community college and got my undergraduate degree, I had some issues with citations, and it's I didn't learn the material, in high school or college. I was kind of gathered a bit here and there, but I didn't have the full understanding of how to do citations until grad school, and that's when I really started using the tutors and learning the information. So right, it's not your if you don't know how to do citations appropriately, yeah, that's fine, right? That's where I was when I was going to community college. But it's something that you can learn, and there are resources to help you. So give some examples of written citations and oral citations. So it has the original text up top. It has how you can paraphrase it, how you can use a direct quote, and how to quote this stuff. So it says both with how to do it written in the outline, because you want it written in the outline, and then you also want to verbally cite it. So these are great examples to look through. So I recommend you go back to this section of the chapter to read through those examples. I'm not going to read through it directly, but I recommend you use the tutors that are available on campus. So again, you're going to have user direct quotes, use all that information, cite even pictures on your visual aid, unless it's clip art or purchase stock images. And sometimes there are a lot of freely available images on the web, but they do want you to cite it. That's the one thing with the Creative Commons license, is that you'll cite where you got that visual aid from. You also want to take into account copyright law. This is important because sometimes students have got in trouble for infringing upon copyright, even if you're citing his sources, right? Citing sources is different from copyright. You might cite the source, but if they didn't give you permission to use the visual aid or use the picture, people can get in trouble with it. So again, you want to look at those ones that have a Creative Commons license for your visual aids or pictures you've taken yourself. Can be create props that you have, but you're going to want to make sure you have permission to use the materials. You can read through that more if you want to learn more about copyright. Next with ethics is setting responsible speech goals. So you have, it says 5 focus areas for the speech goals that may be part of being a responsible public speaker. 1, promote diversity. 2, use inclusive language. 3, avoid hate speech. 4, raise social awareness. And 5, employ respectful free speech. So in the United States, we have the freedom of speech, but we want to make sure we're using it responsibly. So the first part is talking about diversity. So just having an appreciation for the differences among individuals and groups. So diversity in terms of thinking, who is my audience, right? And what sort of speech content is going to be relevant to them? How can you make your audience feel included in the presentation? If you're, talked about in the beginning example about a female giving a presentation to her class that just talked about how to pick out a florist for a wedding. Well, that can be, maybe men don't like flowers as much. Some men do. Some men would love to hear about how to pick a florist. Some people, maybe aren't married or aren't planning on having, getting married. They may not feel included in that topic. When I got married, I didn't have flowers at my wedding. I just we had a little potluck in the park. So it's really not an interesting topic for me. I mean, I'm a teacher, I'll grade any topics, but if I'm just, an audience member, I don't have any reason to hear about that. So, and part of it can be, hey, if you're really passionate about flowers and picking out a florist, how can you make the audience excited about it, right? So that's something to take into account as well with fostering that diversity, making other people appreciate a topic they may not traditionally appreciate. So how do we get them excited about it? So really keep that audience in mind when promoting diversity and respect among individuals and respect for the different topics that we have. It may also be helpful to recognize when some information is coming from a certain perspective. So for me, I've said, in this chapter, some of it is more from a Western perspective with Aristotle and ancient Greece. That is a Western perspective. I'm just acknowledging the perspective and acknowledging there are other perspectives out there. We talked a little bit about Buddhism and how that those ethics are going to be different, but there's so many more perspectives out there. So even naming, saying, hey, this is my frame. This is the frame I'm coming from, right? I have my doctorate. I'm a highly educated person. I've studied communication for a while. So I have my frame of reference, which is going to be different than a communication studies student or someone in a public speaking classroom. They're not going to have the same background and experience as I do. And so I try to make the information approachable to them. And what can they take out of it? How about for someone who's not going to go get a degree in communication studies and is just taking this class because it's a general education requirement? And that might be something to take into account as well. So it talks a little bit here about just being inclusive with using inclusive language. So inclusive language is avoiding gendered language, is how I often hear talked about. So if you're using, firemen versus firefighter, or congressmen versus, member of Congress. So there are different ways to be more inclusive. So it talks here about using, we statements as well. Can be helpful because, so the example it gives here, one way for you to get involved in the city's clean community program is to pick up trash on your street once a month. So again, that's you language telling you to do something, whereas we can unite the audience and bring people together. So one way for all of us to get involved in our local communities is by picking up trash on a regular basis. So this can be seen as more inclusive because you're not just telling other people what they should do, but saying, hey, I'm part of this, we're part of a team together. So it can be more of a motivating factor for us to, hey, let's do this together. We're all in the same boat here. Let's keep our community clean. So that can be part of inclusive language as well. Talks here about avoiding hate speech. So it should go without saying that you should be using hateful or sexist language. So hate speech, according to this source here, vertebra, sell now, and vertebra, is the use of words and phrases not only to demean another person or group, but also express hatred or prejudice. So probably not the best to pick a speech topic saying how much you hate, XYZ community, right? That's probably not a good topic. So you're going to want to be careful here and how to be respectful towards other groups. It also talked about here an example of comedians. They can get in trouble for what they say. And, comedians are trying to make jokes, and the jokes may come at the expense of another group or a group even they belong to, but that can be critiqued, and sometimes rightfully so, when the information is offensive. Now, I'm not anti-humor. I can, I appreciate good jokes. I try and use humor in my classes, but there's a line, sometimes a fine line between what's hateful and what's hurtful versus what's humorous. So, for speech in a classroom, I recommend avoiding telling jokes that target a specific community in general, because again, that's not necessarily appropriate for a classroom environment. Even if it's a joke about your own community, it may be something to take into account because there may be other members of your own community in the audience who may be offended by the joke. Another ethical responsibility is about raising social awareness about issues that impact society. I think it's always good to be practical with your speeches. If you're picking out speech topics, say, hey, what's something that I care about that I want to raise awareness about? So whatever it may be. So it talks about if you have a persuasive speech, you could talk all your classmates to stop texting while driving, or participate in programs that support the U.S. troops by writing letters to deployed soldiers, or buying a pair of Tom shoes to help give basic needs to families around the world. So again, how are you going to create greater meaning to your speech? Raise social awareness for important issues that are affecting society. And once you do it in a public speaking classroom, again, once you're practicing this, you may talk to your family and friends too, and just bring up in conversation, what are some issues you care about? Do you care about the freedom of speech, right? In the public speaking classroom, we care a lot about free speech issues. So how do you promote the freedom of speech in our society? That may be an issue that you care about, that you want to talk about and promote social awareness of. But you're also going to want to take into account your audience's moral base. So, aligning the speech with the moral principles that your audience already has, and you're building on their existing knowledge, their existing beliefs, in order to make them, come more towards your side. So it talks about, an example, if you're a vegetarian and you believe that killing animals for food is murder, but your majority of your audience are not vegetarians, and most of them are meat eaters. So how can you convince that audience, right? You're not trying to convince yourself. You're not trying to remind yourself of why you're a vegetarian. You're trying to convince the audience maybe to eat less meat. That might be a practical goal. So instead of saying, hey, you should become a vegetarian, or you need to be a vegan right now, here's some practical ways in which you can reduce the amount of meat you have in your diet, right? That's a pretty practical way to engage the audience and respect the values of your audience, saying, hey, they believe in eating meat. That's what they believe. That's fine for them. It's different from what I believe, but I'm going to work with their values and their existing beliefs. And then what kind of arguments would be effective for them? Is it about, animal cruelty in the industry of meat production? Is it more about the environmental impact of meat, on people's diets? So there are a variety of approaches that you can take, and find something for you and your audience to agree upon can be very helpful. So again, employ respectful free speech. I talked a lot about how the freedom of speech is important in the United States. So you're going to want to think about how can you engage in that respectfully. It's important to voice your opinion, but how do you voice your opinion in a respectful way, in a respectful forum? I know there was a Supreme Court case about protesting at military funerals. And, again, was that really respectful if a member of the military dies to start protesting the policies of the United States government that have nothing to do with the person who died? That can be disrespectful towards their life and their families. So again, thinking about how to be respectful when engaging in speech, and respectful when we disagree with each other. Again, you can think about this in your personal relationships as well as public speaking. If you're in a disagreement with someone else, how can you create some common ground and have a respectful conversation, and not just get into fights? Again, I don't see fights or yelling at each other as an effective way to persuade other people's mind. by telling someone, oh, you're stupid, you're so wrong, why do you believe that, right? That's not going to change their mind. Most people aren't going to be persuaded about that. I don't think it's effective public speaking, nor is it respectful use of free speech. So again, it's figuring out how to be respectful and how we engage with each other, and respectful even when we disagree, and even when we disagree about matters that are very important to us and that we care about a lot. We can still be respectful in persuading them to come to our side. So ethical listening, so not just as a speaker, but as a listener, it's important to know how to ethically listen. If someone is giving a presentation, and again, something that you may disagree with, you may, again, it may be hard to respectfully listen, but it's good to be able to get in that information and just be able to give them their time to speak, because you'll also want your time to speak and your time to share your information as well. An ethical communicator, this quote here from the National Communication Association, tries to understand and respect other communicators before evaluating and responding to messages. So in communication, we talk about, I got it on my mind, about what responding to a message. Are we listening to respond, or are we listening to understand? That's what I was looking for. So if we're just listening to respond, we may be thinking of our responses or how are we going to get a good comeback to that. But if we're listening to understand, we're trying to understand, why do they believe that way? Why do they think that way? They think in a way that's different than I do. Why is that? Right? So just take more time to listen to understand before just trying to argue with someone or debate them. Right? How am I going to do a good comeback? How am I going to get the better edge of this? Right? That's not as effective as being an ethical listener and being able to have a good conversation, or even convincing them to come to your side. Right? Part of audience analysis is understanding where they're coming from. So you need to be an ethical listener in order to understand where they're coming from. So you can develop those listening skills by just getting rid of distractions around you. So you can focus on the person at hand, the person in your conversation. Sometimes it may be, hey, can you just, again, if you're in an interpersonal conversation, you could say, hey, can we stop for a minute? I need to take care of this, and then I'll give you my full attention. But you also, it says you're listening with your whole body. So again, put the your electronics. I have my laptop here. Put the electronics down. Set things aside and really focus on that person with your full body, giving them appropriate eye contact, and just fully engaging in that conversation can be helpful. So it talks about getting rid of distractions, but also getting rid of distractions in your mind. Again, there are different types of noise that we may think about: psychological noise, physiological noise, environmental noise. And we can put these distractions aside as much as we can in order to focus on the speaker. So part of that may be answering questions and really interacting with them or following up with the information they're sharing. So sometimes if I'm in a conversation with someone I disagree with, again, not just public speaking, but public speaking skills apply outside that setting, I'll ask them questions and saying, okay, well, you say you have that viewpoint, but how about in this situation, if it's a little bit different, do you still view that same way? Or does this make it different? So again, trying to figure out the specific factors which motivate them to believe what they do, and when it may not apply. Because sometimes I hear people say what I view as hateful things, right? Derogatory things for certain groups. But once I get into conversation with them, again, this is the challenge of being an ethical listener, being a respectful listener. Once I get in a conversation with them, I find out they're just sometimes parroting information they heard from other sources, but it's not really true in all cases. So it's not good to say hateful things. But normally people who say hateful things aren't all around hateful. Some of them are, right? Some people are all around hateful towards a certain group. But in most cases, there are exceptions, and the exceptions come from the few cases where they actually have interacted with that group. See, most people I know who have hateful views towards a group don't know anyone in that group, right? They've never met or interacted with, that group out, whatever group they're upset about. So once I start talking to them, I can kind of peel back those layers and get to understand where they're really coming from. And then I can persuade them to not be as hateful, right? And to be a little more respectful of other people, which I think is always important. It also talks here next here about providing ethical feedback to speaker. So ethical feedback has some depth of quality to it. So it's not just saying, oh, I really enjoyed your speech, or you're the worst public speaker ever. Those are helpful comments. So ethical speech is, okay, I really enjoyed your speech because your topic was personally interesting to me, right? I have these other connections to that topic. Or I believe your speech was ineffective because you were clearly unprepared and made no eye contact with the audience, right? You know, being ethical doesn't mean saying nice things or mean things. It means giving constructive feedback and saying why you see it. Why was it a good speech? Could it help a little bit more? There are some cultures and some people who, if you don't give them any negative feedback, they view that as not being respectful of them and not helping them grow. So it's good to give constructive feedback. But most people don't want to hear all negative feedback about their speech and saying, oh, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, you did this wrong. So often it's good to give some compliments and say, hey, I really like these things. Here's one area or two areas where you can improve. But overall, you did a good job, right? And I appreciate you doing it, right? That's how I give my feedback. I normally focus on the positive. I know a lot of students are very anxious about giving speeches. So I try and give detailed feedback. Your speech was good because you did these things well, right? So I try and be very positive with the feedback I give, but I give detailed. So it's ethical feedback because I'm giving the details of here are the things you really did well. And then, you know, if there's some things for them to work on, maybe I'll name one of them or two of them for them. Hey, you could work on these couple of things. Overall, you did a good job. So again, giving those details can be very helpful for people. So this chapter talked about ethics in public speaking. Biggest thing, avoid plagiarism. It's not just turning in someone else's speech as your own. It also can be, you know, not citing your sources properly. So if you need help citing sources, even if you don't need help citing sources, go see a tutor, right? That's what I recommend. Even if I feel, oh, I've cited sources lots of times, I'm doing it fine. Go see a tutor. They can help you refine it and get better skills, or they can reassure you that, yes, you are doing things correctly. I think the tutors on campus are a great resource. So yeah, take advantage of those tutoring resources. But yeah, avoid plagiarism is the biggest thing, but also be ethical in how you're analyzing your audience, how you're using your sources, what sort of information you're doing, what topics you're picking up, pick things you're passionate about. You know, you can raise awareness of social issues and make a lot of meaning in your speech by picking things that the audience can care about, that you care about, and they can make a difference. So there's a lot of ways to be ethical. There's a lot of different values that each of us have, and it's okay to have different ethical values and different moral standpoints. But it's really understanding what are your ethics, you know, and how are you engaging in public speaking in an ethical way. So I appreciate all of you thinking about ethics. Hopefully this chapter helped you understand how ethics applies to public speaking and other communication situations. If you have any further questions, always feel free to reach out. I'm glad to clarify some ideas and give additional information as needed. But thank you for all your time watching this presentation, and I look forward to continuing interacting with you as we work together through this textbook.